Quorum being present, the Committee on Foreign Affairs will come to order. Committee's meeting today for consideration of H.R. 6727, United States Foundation for International Conservation Act of 2023, H.R. 7256, U.S.-South Africa Bilateral Relations Review Act, H.R. 3334, Stop CCP Act, H.R. 5245, Science and Technology Agreement, Enhanced Congressional Notification Act, H.R. 7701, No Russian Tunnel to Crimea Act, H.R. 1084, condemning the killing of Alexei Navalny and calling for the release of all political prisoners in the Russian Federation, H.Res. 901, expressing support for democracy and human rights in Pakistan, H.R. 6831, the Verdad Reauthorization Act, and H.R. 7710, the Locally Led Development and Humanitarian Response Act. Chair announces that any requests for recorded votes may be rolled, and he may recess the committee at any point without objection. So ordered. Pursuant to House rules, I request that members have the opportunity to submit views for any committee report that may be produced on any of today's measures, and without objection, so ordered. Pursuant to notice, I now call up H.R. 6727, the United States Foundation for International Conservation Act of 2023. The bill was circulated in advance, and the clerk shall designate the bill.
H.R. 6727, to establish the United States Foundation for International Conservation and to promote long-term management of protected and conserved areas and for other purposes.
Without objection, first reading is dispensed with. The bill is considered read and open to amendment at any point. I recognize myself in support of the bill. As the chairman of this committee, I've had the opportunity, as most of us have, to travel around the world and see the importance of wildlife conservation firsthand. I've also watched international criminal organizations devastate communities for their own gain. China, specifically, is one of the world's largest markets for illegal wildlife trafficking. Criminal gangs slaughter rhinos for their horns, leopards for their pelts, and turtles for their meat. They sell these products in Chinese black markets, often with the full support of the Chinese Communist Party. And they use the profits to fund human trafficking, illegal drug trade, and other malign activities. This bill enhances environmental protection and builds on my work in conservation. The bill also pushes back against the CCP's malign influence and international criminal elements. I was a co-author of the bipartisan Plastics Act, which removed plastic from our oceans that's devastating to our marine life. And that's why I'm proud to be the author of this bill, the Foundation for International Conservation Act. This is a bipartisan bill with bicameral support that I think most interestingly harvests the power of private philanthropy in a 2-to-1 ratio of private to public spending. Never in my career, 20 years, have I had 10 billionaires come to me and say, sir, we want to put our money to work with the USG on such an important cause. And I have strongly advocated and believe there will be a $100 million offset in appropriations language. So that would mean upon enactment, there would be no new cost to the taxpayers. Some of the bill's top priorities include conservation of endangered species in Africa, marine life in places such as the Galapagos and beyond, and the rainforests, the lungs of our planet, in the Congo, Indonesia, and Amazon. This legislation has received tremendous support from sportsmen's groups like Ducks Unlimited and the Houston Safari Club to conservationists like the World Wildlife Fund and Nature Conservancy. However, this foundation is more than leveraging the power of private contributions. It is a diplomatic investment in the U.S. foreign policy toolkit that none of our adversaries can replicate. Russia and China benefit from instability. Putin profits on the gold and minerals they mine, while native forests from Siberia to the Solomon Islands are being exploited to feed Chinese timber markets. This bill would counter the growing CCP influence in these regions. Wildlife trafficking is a criminal enterprise that often emanates from China with tacit approval from the CCP. In dollar value, illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing costs the global economy as much as $23 billion per year. This legislation will fight the CCP's environmental destruction, bringing stability to local communities, and conserve wildlife, forests, and fisheries. Conservation has a critical role in protecting sensitive ecosystems in our environment, and it's been championed by Republicans for over a century, all the way back to Teddy Roosevelt. So I'm pleased to see that we have this bipartisan support on this critical measure, and I yield back the balance of my time. Is there any discussion on the bill? Mr. Meeks is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm very proud to co-lead this measure that you authored that establishes the United States Foundation for International Conservation. Biodiversity environments critical to our planet and communities are threatened by the impacts of climate change and other man-made threats, including wildlife trafficking, deforestation, and illegal logging, and a demand for agricultural land. We can, we should, and we must find new and innovative ways to strengthen the United States-led conservation efforts. The bill before us does just that. This is a first-of-its-kind foundation which will identify and financially support long-term management of conserved areas and implement projects across a number of eligible countries, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, Latin America, and the Caribbean. It incentivizes private sector community investments and coordinates project implementation with eligible foreign governments, local governments, indigenous people, among other key groups. Advancing global conservation and biodiversity programs cannot rely solely on U.S. government efforts. Instead, we must coordinate and consolidate these efforts in partnership with the private sector and philanthropies deeply engaged on these issues. It is also important that the funds of the foundation supplement existing USAID conservation and biodiversity programs. And so for that, Mr. Chairman, I thank you for your partnership, for your leading and advancing this measure so that we can take the strong steps needed to further catalyze public-private partnerships, to enhance our global conservation goals. With that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields. Any other member seek recognition? Mr. Davidson is recognized.
Move to strike the last word. Chairman, I applaud your love for conservation, and here in America, I think that we could do more to conserve land. I think our national parks are a real treasure here in America, and frankly, we could spend a lot of energy paying attention to our own parks. And I encourage Africa to do everything they can to preserve their natural resources and their parkland. Conservation is important all over the world. And in our own hemisphere, we're seeing the erosion of Amazon rainforest, and that's consequential for so many reasons. And I find it, laudable that we have so many benefactors for this that are willing to give of their own personal wealth to benefit this. So it is interesting that this does say, well, we expect a 2-to-1 match. So you put 2 private dollars in, and the taxpayers will come in for 1. But if you had someone that had a net worth of, say, $63 billion, that's a 1 million to 1 ratio to the median income in my congressional district. So 1 million to 1 would be the more appropriate ratio when you're talking about tax dollars. And in the United States, we're not talking about a country that's running massive surpluses where we have piles of cash, and we're just looking at our own net worth and saying, gosh, what do we do with this? There are lots of good causes all over the world. and we should help them. We are literally borrowing money from China to counteract China. Maybe there's some wisdom in that play, since the money might be borrowed from China to counteract China. I'm open to understanding it, but at this point, I find this bill hard to support, Chairman. And I'd be happy to work with you and the committee staff to understand what I'm missing here. But right now, it looks like the match would be more appropriately 1 million to 1, and I yield.
Gentleman yields, and I appreciate your concerns. I will tell you, when I sat down with them, and they're the top businessmen, not me, but the original offer was 2 government, 1 private. And I said, I cannot do that in this environment. So I was able to get the 1 government, 2 private. I thought that was doing pretty well. But if it was $1 million, $1 million to 1, I would love that idea. So I appreciate your words. Any other members seek recognition? Ms. Dean
Thank
is
you, Chairman.
recognized.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you, Ranking Member. I just want to rise very, very briefly in support of H.R. 6727 to tell you my personal experience that I have for more than a decade been working on an end to the slaughter of elephants around the world, as well as rhinos. We know that they are slaughtered for the illegal trade of ivory and horn, rhino horn. We also know that these resources are often illegally gotten and fuel terrorism. I want to make sure that my grandchildren and their children still know the beauty of this earth and the different species that are on it. So anything we can do about the illegal trade of ivory, the slaughter of elephants and rhino, I'm all in. So thank you, and thanks for both of you working so well together. I yield.
Gentleman yields. Any other members seek recognition? Mr. James.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Last year, I had the pleasure and honor to lead a CODEL to Tanzania that looked into wildlife conservation management and saw firsthand the importance of how best practices from the United States are employed to help manage tourism and other activities on the land, which provides Tanzanians with a form of revenue, employment, and other benefits derived from tourism or trophy hunting. And I'd like to state for the record that we are our brother's keeper. The Lord will not fill what does not flow. And this country is immensely blessed and the best country that's ever existed. And we have an obligation to do both. Take care of our matters on the homeland and also take care of our responsibilities abroad. I learned that Tanzania is both a key wildlife source country and trafficking exit point, and that wildlife trafficking is criminal enterprise that often emanates from China, with tacit approval from the CCP. A lack of well-managed protected areas weakens United States national security and our economy by fueling illegal trade in natural products and creating local and regional instability. It also creates a home for terror organizations that will strike the homeland if left to their own devices. I'm proud to co-sponsor H.R. 6727 to leverage the power of the U.S. private sector and expand on the decades of U.S. conservation leadership. This is a model of what we need to explore moving forward. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields. Any further discussion? Mr. Self is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I appreciate your efforts on this bill, and I will tell you, if you have not been to safari in Africa, it is truly a wondrous experience. But the cost of this bill, you'll have to paint me skeptical on any offset, because I believe this is why we are now $34 trillion in debt, because the offsets are pushed into year 2 and subsequent years. So while I applaud the bill itself, if we have that sort of support from the private sector of people of that sort of means, then I believe we ought to revisit the bill with them, set up the structure, absolutely set up the structure, but allow them to leverage their private money even further than this bill goes. Thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. They do need U.S. government umbrella to make this work, but any further discussion? There being no further discussion of the bill, committee will move to consideration of amendments. Does any member wish to offer an amendment? There being no amendments, I move that the committee report H.R. 6727 to the House with a favorable recommendation. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed signify by saying no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the motion is agreed to. A roll call vote has been requested pursuant to the chair's previous announcement. This vote will be postponed. Pursuant to notice, I now call up H.R. 7256, the U.S.-South Africa Bilateral Relations Review Act. The bill is circulated in advance, and the clerk shall designate the bill.
H.R. 7256 to require a full review of the bilateral relationship between the United States and South Africa. Be it enacted by the Senate and House of Representatives of the United States.
First reading is dispensed with, and bill is considered read and open to amendment at any point. Is there any discussion on the bill? Mr. James is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm here today to speak in support of my bipartisan legislation, H.R. 7256, and the U.S.-South Africa Bilateral Relations Review Act. As chairman of the Subcommittee on Africa, I am acutely aware of South Africa's important role on the African continent, and I'm proud that the United States has held cordial relations with South Africa for nearly my entire life. South Africa has been the United States' largest trading partner in Africa since 2014 and is home to over 600 American businesses. In September, I chaired a subcommittee hearing to discuss the African National Congress's troubling foreign policy alignment and disastrous record of domestic governance. It's clear to me that the ANC of today is no longer the party of Nelson Mandela. Since that hearing, the ANC has continued to move away from its traditional stance of non-alignment in international affairs and has displayed consistent and overt anti-Israel sentiment in the wake of the devastating October 7th attacks. These include South Africa's foreign minister accepting a call from the Hamas leader on October 17th and visiting Tehran to meet with President Raisi on October 22nd. South Africa filing a politically motivated and grossly unfounded case against Israel at the International Court of Justice. South Africa foreign minister stating last week that South Africa will arrest Israeli South Africans who are fighting in the Israeli Defense Forces upon their return home and could strip them of their South African citizenship. Minister Pandor, who is in Washington this week, also implicitly encouraged protests outside the United States Embassy. Well, Madam Minister, you cannot expect to be my partner, cheat on me, and be upset when we consider stop paying your rent. In addition to the overt anti-Israel sentiment, the ANC has increased its alignment with the People's Republic of China and the Russian Federation. In February 2023, on the anniversary of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the ANC hosted joint military exercises with Russia and China off the coast of South Africa, which I covered in my very first piece of legislation, H.Res. 145. Maybe rehearsing drills to kill American soldiers and sailors is not necessarily a position of non-alignment, but a position of provocative aggression. Additionally, the ANC hosted the BRICS conference in Johannesburg in August 2023 and is actively involved itself in Moscow's and Beijing's effort to de-dollarize the global monetary system and rewrite international norms. These actions raise serious questions about the ANC's commitment to upholding democratic values, good governance, and human rights both domestically and throughout Africa. The ANC of today is putting its party above its people and institutions in the Republic of South Africa. It is the fundamental right, let me be clear, it is the fundamental right of every sovereign nation to chart its own direction. However, actions have consequences, and the American people have options. This legislation would simply require the Biden administration to make a determination on whether South Africa's actions are undermining United States national security or foreign policy interests, and conduct a full review of the bilateral relationship between the U.S. and South Africa. The only way that would be threatening is if you are actually undermining the United States and our partnership. It is important to show the South African people that the United States is aware of its plight And it's important to show the American people that they will no longer be played as fools. I'm proud to have introduced this legislation on a bipartisan basis with Congressman Moskowitz from Florida, and I believe it's in the fundamental interests of this committee's oversight responsibility to see it become law. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields. Any other member seek recognition? The Ranking Member Meeks is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. South Africa is a key partner of the United States on issues of both global and regional consequence. As they turn out the lights.
It's the Russians, Mr. Chairman. Don't let them win.
We're talking about China.
South Africa's leadership has been critical to driving innovation and investment on the continent of Africa, as well as expanding mutually beneficial trade with countries around the world. It is also true that South Africa has taken a number of stances on foreign policy matters that I do not agree with and do not believe are helpful to advancing peace and prosperity. But if our goal as the United States is to achieve an open and cooperative partnership with South Africa that supports both of our countries' interests, the bill before us today will not get us to that end. And for that reason, I must oppose it. A year and a half ago, the Biden administration put out a U.S. strategy toward sub-Saharan Africa, noting, and I quote, "It is impossible to meet today's defining challenges without African contributions and leadership," unquote. Underpinning that strategy is the concept that the United States can offer positive choices to Africans as they determine their own future. In other words, we have the opportunity and the responsibility to present options to our African partners that they can judge to be worthwhile and in their best interests. We don't get to impose our ideas, but we should make a compelling case for why it makes sense to partner with the United States and work together to achieve shared interests. If we look at one example not included in the bill's findings, we can see an instance of where we and others successfully used communication with South Africa to achieve a better outcome. When South Africa hosted the BRICS summit in August of last year, they ultimately did not have Vladimir Putin attend in person, though Putin had reportedly originally planned to go. This was an important signal and a step in upholding international commitments that I know I and many of our colleagues here recognize. And finally, I would point out that the certification section of this bill unnecessarily duplicates a process that already exists in statute under the African Growth and Opportunity Act. As an AGOA country, South Africa already receives a yearly review that takes into consideration any activities that undermine U.S. national security or foreign policy interests. This is a requirement for a country to be deemed eligible to participate in AGOA on a yearly basis. So the administration already has the power and responsibility to review whether South Africa has participated in such activities as part of the country's AGOA eligibility review. This legislation is not the right tool to address bilateral relations between the United States and South Africa, and I therefore oppose the bill and the ANS, and look forward to working with my colleague and our partners in South Africa to find a more productive path forward. And with that, I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields. Any further discussion on the bill? Mr. Jackson.
Thank you, Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I rise in opposing this resolution because it does nothing to advance our bilateral relations with South Africa, especially at a time when we need to strengthen it. Despite our differences stemming from the Russian-Ukraine conflict and the Israeli-Hamas conflict, the United States must continue to seek opportunities to increase U.S.-South African cooperation on regional and global issues. South Africa's position on the conflicts in Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine and the ongoing conflict between Israel and Hamas is no different between some of our allies, which we are not questioning our relationships, but with instead we continue to engage them through dialogue to win them over. Since South Africa's transition to a democracy in 1994, just 30 years ago, the United States and South Africa have built a solid bilateral relationship in a very short period of time. South Africa is the largest U.S. trade partner in Africa, with a two-way goods trade of $21 billion in 2021. Approximately 600 American businesses operate in South Africa, and many of those use South Africa as a regional headquarters. According to the IMF, South Africa is set to overtake both Nigeria and Egypt as Africa's largest economy in 2024. As a global voice, strong and vibrant democracy, and a country built on its commitment to human rights, South Africa is a strategic partner of the United States, with strong collaboration and shared global and bilateral priorities, including health, climate, trade, investment, education, and the digital economy. Addressing the challenges that complicate cooperation between these two countries through respectable dialogue will yield enormous returns for both Africa and America, where we have enormous vital national security concerns and interests. I yield back.
Gentleman yields. Any further discussion on the bill? There being no further discussion, let me just say I support this. I find most troubling that South Africa, which is a beautiful country, but now are allowing China and Russia to conduct joint naval exercises off the coast of South Africa. That very much concerns me, and I find that disturbing. But there being no further discussion, the committee will move to consideration of amendments. Does any member wish to offer an amendment? Mr. Perry?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk number 444.
We're going to go with the A&S first. Mr. James is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment in the nature of the substitute at the desk, and I ask for its consideration at this time.
The clerk shall distribute the James amendment in the nature of a substitute. The clerk shall report the amendment.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 7256, offered by Mr. James of Michigan. Strike all after the enacting clause and insert the following. Section 1, short title. This act may be cited as the U.S.-South Africa Bilateral Relations Review Act.
Without objection, further reading of the amendments dispense with. The gentleman, Mr. James, is recognized for 5 minutes on his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm offering this amendment in the nature of a substitute to update the bill since its introduction in February and to include further concerning actions taken by South African government officials and the ANC. As I said in my earlier remarks, just last week, South Africa's foreign minister stated that South Africa will arrest Israeli South Africans who are fighting in the Israeli Defense Forces upon their return home and could strip them of South African citizenship. Minister Pandor, who is in Washington this week, also implicitly encouraged protests outside the United States Embassy. That doesn't sound very friendly to me. Does it to you? The record must reflect that these astounding statements, and I continue to be concerned with South Africa and their trajectory and failure to adhere to stated stance of non-alignment. We are more than welcome to continue the dialogue and make sure that we no longer leave vacuums of United States influence to be filled by our adversaries. But at the same time, it is reasonable to expect our allies to meet us halfway. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
When yields, any other member seek recognition? Ms. Jacobson is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. While I appreciate the concerns my colleagues raised with South Africa's engagement with Russia, I do not agree with this bill's approach. The Biden administration has been clear. Our approach to strategic competition cannot be forcing African countries to choose. Instead, we want to present our African partners with the best choices to make their own decisions and determine their own futures. One incredibly successful program of the United States in South Africa is AGOA, which has created jobs and strengthened U.S. soft power in the country, which we know is critical given the economic challenges everyday South Africans face. I think it's important that as we think about our role on the continent, as we think about strategic competition, we do not punish everyday South Africans for actions of their government that some of us may disagree with. The certification section of this bill duplicates an existing annual review under the AGOA Act and is unnecessary. The U.S. government already has a process to consider all of these factors and determine AGOA eligibility. I oppose this bill, and I urge my colleagues to do the same.
Gentlelady yields. Any other member seek recognition? Mr. James.
Mr. Chairman, I thank you. Hopefully, we can apply those same sentiments when it comes to allowing Israel to run its country. But all this amendment is asking for is making sure, all this bill is asking for, is for the Biden administration to make an assessment of whether or not we are working together as partner. And the only reason this would be threatening to anyone is if they know they have something to hide. I yield back.
Gentleman yields. Any further discussion on the amendment in the nature of a substitute? There being no further discussion, do any members wish to offer an amendment to the James amendment in the nature of a substitute? Mr. Perry is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment at the desk, number 444.
Clerk shall distribute the amendment. Clerk shall report the amendment.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 4256, offered by Mr. Perry of Pennsylvania. Add the following at the end of the following. Section Prohibition on availability of assistance to the government of South Africa. Chapter 1 of Part 1 of the Foreign Assistance Act.
Without objection, for the reading of the amendments dispensed with. The gentleman from Pennsylvania is recognized for 5 minutes on his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First, I want to thank my colleague, Representative James, for introducing a much-needed review of our relationship with South Africa. I agree with him. The findings in this bill lay out the many concerning acts committed by the government of South Africa, including a day after Hamas's October 7th attack on Israel, the ANC's national spokesperson said, I quote, "The decision by Palestinians to respond to the brutality of the settler Israel apartheid regime is unsurprising," unquote. On October 22nd, 2023, South Africa's foreign minister visited with President Raisi of Iran, who is effectively funding terrorist proxy groups that are attacking American and international vessels and other property, assisting the evasion of sanctions by multiple Russian vessels, and cooperating with the CCP on numerous fronts, including state-linked tech firms and China's Belt and Road Initiative. This bill by Mr. James even states outright, as a sense of Congress, that South Africa's foreign policy has, and I quote, long ceased to reflect its stated stance of non-alignment and now directly favors the PRC, the Russian Federation, and Hamas, a known proxy of Iran, and thereby undermines the United States' national security and foreign policy interest, unquote. Why then must we continue to send money to a country that clearly hates our allies and consorts with our enemies? More simply put, as often said in Washington, D.C., why do we have to pay our enemies when they can hate us for free? According to the U.S. government's foreign assistance dashboard in FY23, the U.S. government gave over $281 million to South Africa through USAID, state, and other agencies. This amendment adds a section to the end of the bill that amends the Foreign Assistance Act of 1961 to prohibit funding for any assistance to South Africa until 1 year after the President submits an unclassified determination required by this very bill that South Africa has not engaged in activities that undermine the United States national security or foreign policy interest. Again, the gentlelady from California said, well, why should we punish the people of South Africa who don't agree with their government? And I would say, why should we punish our constituents, our bosses, our taxpayers by sending their hard-earned money to countries that hate us and work against our very interests. This bill makes it clear this government is not deserving of our taxpayers' hard-earned money, especially after a history of actions that run counter, directly counter, to America's interest and our national security. I urge support of the amendment. I thank the gentleman for offering the bill, and I yield the balance.
Gentleman yields. Any other members seek recognition? Ms. Manning is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank you, Ranking Member Meeks, for holding this markup. I'd like to speak on H.R. 7256. I want to thank my friends and colleagues, Representatives John James and Jared Moskowitz, for their work on this issue. I recently traveled to South Africa with a bipartisan, bicameral congressional delegation where I got to see firsthand the tremendous opportunities and challenges in our long-standing relationship with one of the most important countries in the region. It was clear to me that South Africa has major challenges to deal with, from power shortages, which require daily load shedding, to corruption, to healthcare issues. There are numerous areas for cooperation on these and so many other areas. However, I am among those who have questions and concerns about the direction of some of South Africa's recent policies, including its partnerships with Russia and China and unhelpful efforts on the world stage that divide us. That's why I recently led a bipartisan letter with my friend and our subcommittee chairman, Congressman Chris Smith, and more than 200 members of Congress on both sides of the aisle to Secretary Blinken, expressing our outrage with the groundless case brought by South Africa against Israel at the International Court of Justice, accusing our ally Israel, the only democracy in the Middle East, of committing genocide. Israel is a democracy defending itself against the terrorist group Hamas that is dedicated to its destruction. And I am glad that the United States has made clear its stance on the ICJ case, which the State Department agrees is unfounded. This is not just an issue for the U.S. and for Israel, but also for South Africa's own citizens. Its Jewish community, the largest on the continent. They have made clear that the government of South Africa has ignored or downplayed their concerns of anti-Semitism, which have been documented on the rise throughout the country since October 7th. In fact, since the filing of the genocide petition, anti-Semitism in South Africa has risen by more than 600%. Mr. Chairman, I would like to request unanimous consent to include in the record a statement from the South African Jewish Board of Deputies on the ICJ case, in which they make clear that the government has treated their concerns over anti-Semitism with contempt and call out the double standards South Africa applies toward Israel compared with Vladimir Putin's Russia, Sudan, and beyond.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you. That's why I think it's worthwhile that this committee take a closer look at these developments and trend lines in our very important bilateral relationship and work with the administration to be clear-eyed and realistic about our interests and where they may diverge. So in closing, I support the intention of the bill and the ANS, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentlelady yields. Any further discussion? Mr. James is recognized.
The overwhelming majority of U.S. foreign assistance to South Africa is for health programs, and specifically for PEPFAR. In fiscal year 22, the United States provided $660 million of foreign assistance to South Africa. Of this, $604 million was for health programs, and $428 million for PEPFAR. Cutting all foreign assistance to South Africa would almost exclusively be impacting the South African people. Now, why is that important? Because there is no evidence that the ANC elites and leadership will adopt policies more favorable to the United States as the result of increased poverty and suffering that a prohibition of U.S. assistance to South Africa will cause. In this case, directly, it seems the United States cares more about the South African people than the ANC. The ANC already ruled over a 2-decade decline in South Africa's economic output and living standards, so I don't believe that removing PEPFAR assistance would create the desired behavioral change in the South African government's policies. This amendment's prohibition of all assistance to government of South Africa, I believe, while it comes from a good place and certainly warrants discussion, may be a bit broadly focused and would overwhelmingly push ordinary South African people away while having no impact on the ANC elites who are in charge of South African government's policymaking. Additionally, this amendment would prohibit foreign assistance for an additional one-year period following the president's submission of the review on whether or not South Africa is undermining U.S. national security. Any funding determinations should be made on the merits of the review once concluded, and not on a timeline that may be at odds with the conclusion or the review. So our efforts here today are clearly to motivate our partners in South Africa back to the table, not to push them away. And it's for these reasons that I have to oppose this amendment. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields. Any other member seat recognition? Mr. Meeks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I oppose this amendment. And while, as I stated earlier, I disagree with the approach of the underlying bill and the section requiring a determination from the president on whether South Africa has engaged in activities that undermine U.S. national security or foreign policy interests is duplicative of a process that already exists in statute. However, this amendment takes things even further in the wrong direction by prejudging any determination or certification made by the president because it cuts off funding for South Africa before a determination is made. It is rash and ill-considered to cut off funding to a partner country with no due process, especially when that funding would cut off our incredibly important PEPFAR work with South Africa, which provides HIV prevention, care, and treatment. Literally life-saving work. If the point of the bill is to undertake a review, then that review must take place before the U.S. imposes significant consequences like cutting off funding. And therefore, I strongly disagree with this and oppose this amendment. I yield back.
Gentleman yields. Any further discussion on the amendment? There being no further discussion, the question now occurs on the amendment offered by Mr. Perry, number 92, to the amendment in the nature of substitute. All those in favor signify by saying aye. All those opposed signify by saying no.
No.
In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it, and the amendment is not agreed to. Sorry, Scott. Are there any further amendments? There being no further amendments, the question now occurs on the amendment in the nature of substitute number 92 offered by Representative James. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed signify by saying no.
No.
In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to. There being no further amendments, I move that the committee report.
No, that wasn't reporting. That was the ENS. We're reporting right now.
I move that the committee report HR 7256 is amended to the House with a favorable recommendation. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed signify by saying no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the motion is agreed to. A roll call vote has been requested. Pursuant to the chair's previous announcement, this vote will be postponed. Pursuant to notice, I now call up HR 3334, the Stop CCP Act. The bill was circulated in advance. The clerk shall designate the bill.
HR 3334, to provide for the imposition of sanctions on members of the National Communist Party Congress of the People's Republic of China and for other purposes.
Without objection, the first reading is dispensed with. Bill is considered read and open to amendment at any point. Is there any discussion on the bill? Mr. Barr is recognized.
Move to strike the last word. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This bill from Representative McLean authorizes sanctions against CCP Central Committee members who are responsible for aggression against Taiwan, the oppression of Hong Kong, and human rights abuses against the Uyghurs in China. This bill addresses gaps in our current sanctions regime by drawing attention to the critical role played by decision-makers in the CCP's Central Committee. The bill also creates a sanctions authority tied directly to aggressive conduct by the PRC towards Taiwan. With the new authority in this bill, we can ensure that the leaders of the Chinese Communist Party are held personally accountable for the malign activities they direct and design. By ensuring CCP decision-makers are held personally accountable, this bill will help deter political oppression and human rights abuses by the CCP. This legislation is a common-sense step to encourage the CCP to choose responsible action and respect for human rights over malign activities and political oppression. The ANS incorporates technical fixes to ensure that the sanctions called for by the underlying bill can be implemented without unintended consequences. The amendment, in a nature of substitute, expressly ties the sanctions to the conduct we want to deter, thereby preserving the sanctions' deterrent effect while ensuring that they can be safely implemented and are secure against any legal challenge. The ANS preserves the bill's powerful deterrent message to any CCP officials who want to trample human rights, oppress political freedom in Hong Kong, or engage in aggression against Taiwan. Do not do it, or there will be serious consequences. It is unfortunate that I understand the ranking member is not inclined to support this bill. I would urge him and all members on both sides of the aisle to reconsider in light of the changes made by this ANS, which should resolve any technical or legal concerns that any member may have. I support this important legislation offered by the gentlewoman from Michigan, and I urge my colleagues to do the same. I yield.
Gentleman yields. Any member seek recognition? Mr. Meeks is recognized.
Again, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I do oppose this bill. This bill appears to be a tough on China by sanctioning all of the PRC's top leadership, including the president, premier, and senior ministers. But this unilateral escalation would cause an unprecedented fissure in U.S.-China relations, raising the tensions to a level that we haven't seen since establishing diplomatic ties with the PRC. By passing this bill, we would hinder our ability to pressure Beijing to change course on its policies. While there is tremendous bipartisan agreement that the People's Republic of China is a grave geopolitical threat, this bill makes clear that there are very different perspectives on how to address that challenge. Instead of thinking about effective ways to outcompete Beijing and counter its worst impulses, we are seeing policy proposals that would be ineffective, counterproductive, and actually harmful to America. The bill before the committee imposes sweeping mandatory sanctions across the top tier of China's leadership without any thought to how this might impact U.S. officials and businesses who may need to engage PRC officials to advance the United States' interests. It includes no workable waiver to ensure that sanctions don't harm U.S. national security or interests. By sanctioning all top leaders in one fell swoop, it would rupture the United States-China relationship while failing to deter China and its malign behavior. You see, poking China in the eye in ways that only raise tensions in the region isn't a strategy. Preventing American officials, diplomats, and military leaders from having open lines of communication with their counterparts isn't a strategy. Thankfully, the Biden administration does have a strategy. It has implemented unprecedented policies to prevent U.S. critical technology from being exported to China. It has invested time and effort to build a coalition of partners and allies to counter China's aggression and coercion. And with Congress's support, it has invested in America's research and innovation capacity in critical industries through the CHIPS and Science Act and the Inflation Reduction Act so that we can outcompete China economically and create jobs for the future here in the United States of America. An essential component of this strategy, however, is deterrence and diplomacy to ensure that competition does not veer into conflict. The bill in front of us today will upend that strategy, making it incredibly difficult to engage China on anything to advance our interests, whether it is fentanyl, regional security, Taiwan, human rights, or IP theft. So I must oppose this measure and ask my members of this committee to do the same. And I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields. Is there any discussion on the bill? There being no further discussion of the bill, the committee will move to consideration of amendments. Does any member wish to offer an amendment? Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment in the nature of a substitute at the desk, and I ask for its consideration at this time. The clerk shall distribute the bar amendment in the nature of a substitute number 85. Okay, the clerk shall report the amendment.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 3334, offered by Mr. Barr of Kentucky. Strike all after the enacting
Without
clause.
objection, further reading of the amendment is dispensed with. I recognize myself for 5 minutes on the amendment. Let me just say that the amendment that the amendment in the nature of substitute that we presented, as I said in my opening comments, provides some technical fixes to ensure that the sanctions called for by this legislation can be implemented without unintended consequences. And I appreciate my friend, the ranking member's comments, and he's always thoughtful about these things, about what is the right strategy to deter the Chinese Communist Party. And I think in his comments opposing Congresswoman McClain's legislation, and I'm summarizing, but my friend basically made the argument that it's too provocative, that it pokes the CCP in the eye, that it would risk deteriorating relations or heightened tensions between the United States and China. That ship has sailed, with all respect. Tensions are high, and they're high not because of the United States. They're high because of the provocative actions of the Chinese Communist Party and the Central Committee members that this bill targets. And one thing that the ranking member said in opposition to the legislation was that we need a strategy. We just don't need to be raising tensions unnecessarily. Well, what I would consider the absence of a strategy is chasing diplomacy from a position of weakness and not actually deterring China. And the problem that I have with this administration's lack of strategy is the idea that we have to make upfront concessions with the expectation or hope that we will get some kind of reciprocity on the back end. That's not what we've seen. And so when we do negotiate with the Chinese Communist Party, when we do engage the Chinese Communist Party, they don't believe that we're serious. They don't believe that we're going to do anything to counter their aggression and their human rights violations and their provocations across the Taiwan Strait. Negotiations are effective only when you negotiate from a position of strength. And what I think the gentlewoman's legislation does in this case, by actually demonstrating resolve and sanctioning bad behavior when it happens, is to put the United States in a position of strength when we do go to the negotiating table. We cannot chase diplomacy, we cannot chase concessions with the hope that the Chinese Communist Party will change its behavior unless we show them we mean business. And Congresswoman McClain's bill does that. There is a strategy associated with this legislation. The strategy is to give us the leverage that we need to actually achieve the diplomatic objectives that we want. We all want peace. We don't want to raise tensions unnecessarily. But in order to achieve peace, we need deterrence. And deterrence requires strength. And Representative McClain's legislation, I think, represents that strength. That's why I support the the underlying legislation and the amendment in the nature of a substitute. If we cannot sanction gross human rights violations, if we cannot sanction CCP officials who are manifestly demonstrating an aggressive posture towards Taiwan, then we're not prepared to deter Chinese Communist Party aggression. I urge my colleagues to favorably consider this legislation.
Gentlemen, yield for a second.
I will. I will yield to
And
my
I thank
friend.
you for your comments. I just have one question. If we can't talk to anybody, how are we going to be at the table to talk about diplomacy?
Reclaiming my time, it's a good question. I think you're right. I think this bill, though, doesn't prevent the United States from engaging in diplomacy. It does restrict, with the sanctions that are applied in the bill, it does restrict CCP officials from engaging in certain, or having access to certain privileges. This bill would not disallow Secretary Blinken from communicating with the CCP officials. That's not what it would do. But it would say that we're not going to stand by idly by when you violate the rules of international law, when you do not respect the territorial integrity of the democracy of Taiwan, when you engage in provocative, aggressive military exercises in violation of the airspace of Taiwan, when you saber rattle with respect to Taiwan, when you engage in gross human rights violations, whether it's the Uyghurs or Hong Kong, there should be consequences to that. And when we show CCP officials that there are consequences with sanctions, then we're negotiating from a position of strength. We actually help the Biden administration's diplomats, including Secretary Blinken, in that scenario, in my view. I yield back. Do any other members seek recognition? There being no further discussion, do any members wish to offer an amendment to the Barr Amendment in the nature of a substitute? The ranking members, the ranking members recognized?
Yeah. Thank you. I just want to say, and well, just take me a few seconds. Gentlemen, and I respect Mr. Barr and very much, good friend, ideas, both here and in financial services. Strength. I think the strength that we in the Biden administration has shown is, for the first time, South Korea and Japan are talking to one another. We see the Quad coming together. We see nations in the Indo-Pacific coming together under the leadership, and we come to the table as one. That's strength. You know, you can't lead if there's nobody following you. So just bringing people together is strength. Bringing it to people to strength. And when I look at this bill and it calls for visa sanctions, that would prevent anybody from traveling to America so that we can have these conversations. If we sanction the defense minister, then we couldn't have any male-to-male dialogue and conversation. That is not the way of diplomacy. That, to me, does not mean or show strength. And that's why I said all we're doing is poking China in the eye in ways that only raise tensions in the region, and that is not a strategy. I yield back.
The gentleman yields. There being no further discussion, do any members have an additional amendment, or there being no further amendments or discussion on the bill, the question now occurs on the amendment in the nature of substitute number 85, offered by myself. Those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed signify by saying no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to. There being no further amendments, I move that the committee report H.R. 3334 as amended to the House with favorable recommendation. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed signify by saying no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the motion is agreed to.
Roll call.
A roll call vote has been requested pursuant to the chair's previous announcement. This vote will be postponed. Pursuant to notice, I now call up H.R. 5245, the Science Technology Agreement Enhanced Congressional Notification Act of 2023. The bill was circulated in advance. The clerk shall designate the bill.
H.R. 5245, to amend the State Department Basic Authorities Act of 1956 to require certain congressional notification prior to entering into, renewing, or extending a science and technology agreement with the People's Republic of China and for other purposes.
Without objection, the first reading is dispensed with, and the bill is considered read and open to amendment at any point. Without objection, the bar amendment in the nature of a substitute number 80 circulated to members in advance shall be considered as read and will be treated as original text for purposes of amendment. I recognize myself in support of my legislation. H.R. 5245 is entitled the Science and Technology Agreement Enhanced Congressional Notification Act of 2023. This bill is a bipartisan effort aimed at enhancing transparency and accountability in the U.S.-China relations by imposing congressional oversight on science and technology partnerships between our two nations. This bill reinstates a reporting requirement from the 2003 NDAA that was repealed in 2016, mandating the Secretary of State to detail the benefits of any science and technology agreements with the People's Republic of China. Beyond reporting, this bill introduces an enhanced notification to Congress before any science and technology agreements with China are implemented. Currently, Congress lacks oversight over the administration's agreements with China, as exemplified by the recent extension of the Science Technology Agreement with the CCP without disclosure of its details. Let me be clear, this bill prioritizes our national security, human rights, and technological leadership. It aims to safeguard American innovation and conduct thorough risk assessments to prevent illicit technology or intellectual property transfers that could benefit the People's Liberation Army, while also safeguarding the safety of American researchers in China. Additionally, we seek to broaden oversight by requiring reporting not only on science and technology agreements, but also on implementing arrangements with PRC entities that could enhance the CCP's scientific and military capabilities. The last time Congress legislated oversight on STAs was 2003. But China is not the same country as it was 20 years ago. Under President Xi, China's ambition to become a science and technology superpower is closely intertwined with its military modernization efforts. This civil-military fusion is a real threat to national security. To prevent the CCP from leveraging our expertise for military purposes, it is essential that any science and technology agreements are rigorously vetted to ensure they do not contribute to strengthening Chinese military-industrial complex. As U.S. Ambassador to China, Nicholas Burns recently emphasized on 60 Minutes, the PRC continues to systematically steal intellectual property from American companies operating in China. Academic espionage by China is significant and real. Estimates suggest that the annual theft of U.S. intellectual property and trade secrets ranges from $225 billion to $600 billion, with a significant portion attributed to the CCP. It is past time Congress exert its powers of oversight to ensure that U.S. joint research with the PRC remains beneficial for U.S. interests and in the interest of peace, and not in the interest of CCP's military superiority objectives. Thank you for marking up H.R. 5245, and I yield back. Is there any discussion on the bill? The ranking member is recognized.
Thank you, and I support this measure by Representative Barr and Dina Titus. And my thanks to Mr. Barr and Chairman McCall for working with me to get this bill into a bipartisan place so that we can have robust oversight over any U.S.-China governmental science cooperation. We all know the challenges posed by the People's Republic of China. We will be discussing the economic and technological aspects of our competition at a hearing in this very room tomorrow. But China isn't going anywhere, and the American people do not want conflict. They want a stable and constructive competition with China. This is why we must continue to engage China and find areas of cooperation, even as we vigorously contest, compete, and when necessary, confront Beijing. As the first bilateral agreement of our nation signed after we recognized the PRC, the United States-China Science and Technology Agreement, or STA, is critical to our interests. The engagement has facilitated research projects in areas of shared interest, resulting in benefits for the United States, China, and the rest of the world. As long as it's done with proper safeguards and monitoring, science cooperation can be beneficial to the United States. And this is why it's critical that we have a robust U.S.-China STA. The United States has nearly 60 STAs with nations around the world. And while government-to-government cooperation can take place without them, these agreements provide a set of bilateral accepted standards, rules, and protections that guide the research and provide access and protections to American researchers. In other words, an STA is a critical mechanism to ensure that any government-to-government science cooperation is done safely and is in our national interests. Mr. Barr's bill would allow Congress to conduct a robust oversight over the U.S.-China STA through a notification that outlines how the agreement benefits the United States and how it can further bolster to protect U.S. interests. It will also enable Congress to monitor all the joint activities and cooperative projects that are taking place under the agreement to ensure that we are not indirectly assisting Beijing in ways that may undermine the United States' values or interests. And with that, I yield back. I support the bill, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Is there any additional discussion on the bill? There being no further discussion of the bill, oh, I'm sorry. Oh. The gentlelady and the co-sponsor of the bill, I want to thank the gentlelady, Congresswoman Titus, for her bipartisan work with this, and I recognize her for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Barr, and it's a pleasure to work with you on this. But I have an amendment in the nature of a substitute that I would ask the committee to consider. Not yet?
The clerk shall distribute the amendment.
Oh, sorry. I think it is. I think we've already done the amendment. Okay. Sorry.
I'm back. I
Gentlelady's recognized.
I apologize, Mr. Chairman. The amendment in the nature of a substitute has already been offered.
Okay, right.
And now I'm speaking in favor of that amendment. Okay, thank you, and I apologize. The bipartisan ANS being offered makes improvements to the underlying text, and I'm glad to be the Democrat lead on this measure and to partner with my Republican colleague on it. The State Department facilitates government-to-government science collaboration by providing ground rules and standards on issues such as the protection of intellectual property. There are nearly 60 bilateral science and technology agreements and more than 2,000 sub-agreements currently in force. The engagements facilitated by these agreements provide valuable access for U.S.-based scientists to get to foreign scientific capabilities, facilities, and expertise, while also informing allies about why the U.S. is the technological and scientific leader in the world. We share our norms, our procedures, and our values. Scientific cooperation has the potential to benefit the U.S. and the world by positively contributing to public health, addressing climate change, and supporting innovation. The U.S.-China Science and Technology Agreement became the first bilateral deal signed after the U.S. formally recognized the PRC in 1979. Since then, the agreement has been renewed every 5 years, the last time, though, being in 2018. It paused for a while, was renewed for 6 months, renewed for another 6 months. This would put it in place back to the 5-year standard. So currently, the administration is in active negotiations to amend and renew the agreement like originally intended. This ANS endorses scientific cooperation with China when it's in the interest of the United States. It also mandates that the State Department submit to Congress a notification before a renewal or extension of a science and technology agreement with China. That's a good thing because it enhances the role that Congress can play in oversight. Similarly, for any existing agreement, state must submit a notification within 90 days outlining the terms of the agreement and how it bolsters national security for Congress to take into account. It's important to note that this bill takes a clear-eyed approach to these agreements due to the sensitivity of technological exchanges. The congressional notifications that are mandated here emphasize the national security implications of the agreement, push the administration to safeguard our U.S. intellectual property, and ensure state is able to monitor and evaluate the implementation of the agreement. I think it's a smart bill because it's tough on China while ensuring the continuation of constructive diplomacy. It puts conflict and competition aside, but puts U.S. interests first, and that's good for us as well as for the rest of the world. So I thank my colleague for allowing me to join him in this effort. I apologize for getting there a little mixed up with the procedure, and I urge my colleagues to support this bipartisan measure. Now yield back.
The gentlelady yields back, and I associate myself with the gentlelady from Nevada's comments and agree wholeheartedly with everything she said. Is there any further discussion? There being no further discussion of the bill, the committee will move to consideration of amendments. Does any member wish to offer an amendment? There being no amendments, I move that the committee report H.R. 5245 as amended to the House with a favorable recommendation. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed signify by saying no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the motion is agreed to. A roll call vote. As for roll call vote, a roll call vote has been requested pursuant to the chair's previous announcement. This vote will be postponed. Pursuant to notice, I now call up H.R. 7701, the No Russian Tunnel to Crimea Act. The bill was circulated in advance. The clerk shall designate the bill.
H.R. 7701 to require the imposition of sanctions with respect to any foreign person.
Without objection, the first reading is dispensed with, and the bill is considered read and open to amendment at any point. Is there any discussion on the bill?
Mr. Chairman.
The ranking member is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In February of 2022, Vladimir Putin traveled to Beijing to meet with President Xi at the start of the 2022 Winter Olympics. At that meeting, two leaders declared a no-limits partnership between Russia and China. Several weeks later, Putin invaded Ukraine and tried to overthrow the democratically elected government in Kyiv. With its purchases of oil and gas and its exports of semiconductors, the PRC has become an economic lifeline to the Kremlin. In addition, China has not provided the type of security assistance that the United States and Europe have provided to Ukraine. Given this record, reports that Russian officials met with leaders of leading Chinese state-owned construction firms about building a tunnel from Russian mainland to Crimea were deeply, deeply concerning. Crimea is strategically important, and the Russian-built Kerch Bridge connecting Russia to Crimea is of crucial military and symbolic importance. The Ukrainians have successfully targeted the bridge multiple times, shutting down the bridge at various intervals over the past 2 years. A tunnel from Russia to Crimea would bolster Putin's control over the Crimean Peninsula and aid its war effort. It must be the position of the United States government to sanction any company or person that will participate in such a construction project. That's what my bill does. It is a clear signal to the world that this tunnel should not be constructed. This committee in particular must use the available tools in our legislative toolkit to aid Ukraine. And I thank Rep. Wilson for his partnership on this bill, as well as Chairman McCall for putting this legislation on the markup calendar, and for him and his team's valuable input to the legislation. I also appreciate other members who have been quick to co-sponsor this legislation since its introduction. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
The gentleman yields. Any other discussion, any further discussion on the bill? There being no further discussion, the committee will move to consideration of amendments. Does any member wish to offer an amendment? Seeing none, there being no further amendments, I move that the committee report H.R. 7701 to the House with favorable recommendation. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed signify by saying no.
Roll call.
In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the motion is agreed to. A roll call vote has been requested. Pursuant to the chair's previous announcement, this vote will be postponed.
You're getting pretty good at that. I don't know, you got a future. Not ready for him to.
You didn't say anything, hot mic on him?
That's my nickname.
Hot mic. Is this yours or is this mine?
This little button says go.
Don't worry, I'm not.
Pursuant to notice, I now call up HRES 1084, condemning the killing of Alexei Navalny and calling for the release of all political prisoners in the Russian Federation. Resolution was circulated in advance, and the clerk shall designate the resolution.
HRES 1084, condemning the killing of Alexei Navalny and calling for the release of all political prisoners in the Russian Federation.
Without objection, the reading is dispensed with. Resolution is considered read and open to amendment at any point. Is there any discussion on the resolution? Ms. Wild is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I rise in support of House Resolution 1084, condemning the killing of Alexei Navalny and calling for the release of all political prisoners in the Russian Federation. This legislation is about sending an unequivocal message. We will not forget what happened to Alexei Navalny because of his activism and his efforts to hold Vladimir Putin accountable. And we will not forget those who languish in Russia's prisons today, political prisoners, and all those held unjustly by the regime, including multiple U.S. citizens. This legislation establishes the circumstances that led to Mr. Navalny's death: the assassination attempt in 2020, his courageous decision to return to Russia, knowing the threats that he faced, his sentencing, and the multiple stages of his imprisonment, during which Russian authorities engaged in documented patterns of inhumane practices, including torture, and neglected his health and safety. The legislation condemns the killing of Mr. Navalny, establishes that the Russian government is responsible for his death, expresses solidarity with the families of all those unjustly detained in Russia, and urges their immediate release, and calls on the Secretaries of State and Treasury to impose additional sanctions on Russian authorities that played a role in Mr. Navalny's killing. I want to thank my colleague, Representative Ann Wagner, for standing with me in support of this legislation, as well as other colleagues of both parties who have co-sponsored the resolution. And I want to recognize Representative Keating for his tireless leadership on these issues. Together, let us come together to pass this resolution with a resounding bipartisan margin, and let us work to ensure that the voices of all those unjustly detained in Russia and around the world are never forgotten. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
General yields. Any further discussion? Ms. Dean's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Ranking Member Meeks. I rise in support of HRES 1084. I begin by expressing my sincerest condolences to the family and friends of Alexei Navalny. We here in America grieve with you. We must always stand up for those who fight for democracy and against corruption. and condemn those who would seek to stamp out all dissent in their selfish pursuit of power. The mistreatment of Mr. Navalny, from the attempt to assassinate him, to his politically motivated prosecution and subsequent imprisonment, to the inhumane conditions and torture he was subjected to in prison, to his untimely killing at the hands of the Russian government, is simply unconscionable and must be condemned in the strongest possible terms. I want to make sure to highlight that thousands of people attended Mr. Navalny's funeral at great potential risk to themselves, a testament to his lasting impact on the people of Russia and their opposition to authoritarian rule. I also recognize all those who continue Mr. Navalny's noble work and strive to uphold his legacy, despite threats of prosecution and violence against them. We stand with you. We must work to ensure that no one else is subjected to the same horrors for standing up for democracy and the rule of law. And we must seek the release of those currently held as political prisoners by the Russian government. I urge my colleagues, all of my colleagues, to support this resolution, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields. Any further discussion? Mr. Keating is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment at the desk.
Let's see. Okay, I have to start by saying there being no further discussion of the resolution, the committee will move to consideration of amendments. Does any member wish to offer an amendment? Mr. Keating is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I still have an amendment at the desk.
And the clerk shall distribute the amendment. Clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to HRES 1084, offered by Mr. Keating of Massachusetts. Page 4, line 15, strike prisoners on and insert prisoners, including Vladimir Kara-Murza on.
Without objection, further reading is dispensed with. Gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized for 5 minutes on his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to thank you and Ranking Member Meeks for having this important markup today. As Ranking Member on the Subcommittee on Europe, I'd like to begin by giving my thanks to this committee for considering two measures today, which I have co-sponsored and which push back on Russian malign influence and support Ukraine in its time of need. First, the No Russian Tunnel to Crimea Act by Representative Meeks and Representative Wilson imposes sanctions on any individual who seeks to connect the Russian mainland with illegally occupied Crimea. Russian claims to Crimea are illegitimate and illegal, and it's important we continue to impose costs on the Kremlin and any groups that further these malign interests. Second, House Res 1084 condemns Russia's murder of Alexei Navalny and calls for the release of all political prisoners in Russia, such as Vladimir Kara-Murza. This amendment that we are now discussing ensures Vladimir's name remains on the record, and they will continue to work towards his release. Evgenia Kara-Murza, an esteemed advocate of Russian democracy and wife of Vladimir, was my guest as at President Biden's State of the Union address. She, like many others, hopes for a day when Russia will be free from Putin's reign of terror. The resolution also calls for the release of U.S. citizens Paul Whelan, Evan Gershkovich, Alsu Kermasheva, who continue to be held on bogus charges in Russia. Their release is a top priority of this administration, and I look forward to the day we can welcome them home. I want to give personal thanks in particular to Representative Susan Wild for her steadfast leadership on this important issue. Next, I want to thank Chairman McCall and Ranking Member Meeks for working with me to pass H.R. 1809, the Block Transatlantic Technology and Iranian Drones Act, and House Res 81, calling on the President to support the creation of a special tribunal for the crime of aggression against Ukraine. They supported these things through markup in the committee, and I also want to thank this committee for passing HCON Resolution 27 through markup, which calls for Vladimir Kara-Murza's immediate release. I'm hopeful these bills will help fight sanctions and the sanction evasion by Iran and support Ukraine's cause for freedom and condemn the Kremlin's crackdown on the opposition, and I hope that this will be considered in the House floor as soon as possible, and I urge the chairman to support me in these efforts. While the measures being considered today are important to supporting Ukraine's war effort and condemning Russia's malign influence, it is beyond comprehension that Speaker Johnson continues to hold up bipartisan legislation to support Ukraine, which has been sitting there for over a month. This legislation would not only give Ukraine much-needed funds to protect its people and sovereignty, while also, and this is important, providing the weapons it needs to fight back against Putin's bloody invasion. It will also go towards replenishing our own defense stockpiles in a time where threats are arising in the Indo-Pacific and the Middle East, and where U.S. interests are threatened at home and abroad. Speaker Johnson's delay is harmful to U.S. interests, and now more than 2 years after after they launched an unprovoked and full-scale invasion of Ukraine, House GOP leadership plays politics with the lives of Ukrainians who are defending the cause of freedom on their homeland. President Biden has been resolute in his support for Ukraine since the beginnings of these wars and well before. Our European allies and partners have provided significant military, humanitarian, and financial aid to Ukraine. By abandoning our allies in their time of need, we are signaling to Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran that their actions will go unpunished and that the United States will just simply stand idly by while they further their malign goals. The U.S. has led a global coalition of allies, more than 50, and partners in support of Ukraine. And now is not the time to falter. It's time Speaker Johnson brought the bipartisan National Security Supplemental to a vote. History is watching. I yield back.
Gentleman yields. Any further discussion on the gentleman's amendment? There being no further discussion, the question now occurs in the amendment offered by Representative Keating, number 72. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed signify by saying no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to. Are there any further amendments? There being no further amendments, I move that the committee report HRES 1084 as amended to the House with a favorable recommendation. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed signify by saying no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the motion is agreed to.
Mr. Chairman, I request a roll call vote.
Roll call vote has been requested pursuant to the chair's previous announcement. This vote will be postponed. We have votes on the floor, so therefore this committee will take a short recess until after votes on the floor. I believe we have 3 additional measures, so we'll be able to finish before the second series, I hope, and have electronic votes. All right. The committee will come to order. Pursuant to notice, I now call up H.R. 6831, the Verdad Reauthorization Act. Bill was circulated in advance. The clerk shall designate the bill.
H.R. 6831, to authorize the Venezuela Emergency Relief, Democracy Assistance, and Development Act of 2019.
Without objection, first reading is dispensed with. The bill is considered read and open to amendment. At any time, is there any discussion on the bill? Ms. Salazar is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for the opportunity, and thanks the committee. Today, we're considering H.R. 6831, my bill to reauthorize the Verdad Act on Venezuela. Verdad means truth. This is a critical bipartisan legislation at a pivotal moment for that country in South America. The people's choice was Maria Corina Machado, who won the opposition primary for presidential contender with over 90% of the popular vote. 2.5 million Venezuelans around the world participated and voted for her in an overwhelming number. But the Maduro regime at this hour has not let her participate in the presidential elections because they fear her popularity, and even more, they fear she will win the presidency in July. That is why we, the United States and Congress, we should reauthorize the Verdad Act. Since 2019, this act was Congress's landmark bill on Venezuela and has given us the tools to fight the Chavista military oppression. This is what it does, three main things. It forbids the export of any military equipment to Venezuela so they cannot continue repressing their people. Number two, it revokes the visas of armed dealers who sell Russian weapons to Venezuela. Number three, it freezes the assets in the United States of anyone who commits human rights abuses in Venezuela, like we are seeing right now in the persecution of Maria Corina Machado, whom I said is the top presidential candidate, and her political team. I believe, Mr. Chairman, that we need to reestablish pressure on the Maduro regime, and the Verdad Act will give us those tools, which I just mentioned, and those will help us to accomplish what we want, which is freedom and democracy for the Venezuelans. As you know, everyone in the world, or most people in the world, would like to come to Disney World or to go to Saks Fifth Avenue on Manhattan to shop. But if you are not on the side of democracy and freedom, specifically in Venezuela, you're not going to be able to do either one. And your apartment on Brickell Avenue, right in the heart of my district, number 27 in Florida, will be seized. And your bank accounts in downtown Miami, also part of my district, will be frozen until Venezuela is free. I urge my colleagues to support this bill, and I yield back the balance of my time. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields. Is there any further discussion? Ranking Member Meeks is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I strongly oppose this measure. On October 17, 2023, the Maduro government and the unitary platform in Venezuela signed the Barbados Agreement, making a return to formal negotiations and a path to elections in 2024. Now, I do share the deep concern of my colleagues on both sides of the aisle regarding certain steps taken by the Maduro government in this process, including the disqualification of opposition presidential candidate Maria Corina Machado. Despite these challenges, however, the Maduro government has made and continues to make progress on fundamental pillars of the agreement, including setting a date for elections to take place on July 28, 2024. And while I voted to pass the Verdad Act in 2019, I am concerned today that the timing of this legislation will prove counterproductive to the United States foreign policy goals in Venezuela and potentially set back momentum. It appears to me that reauthorizing sanctions against a government that is taking steps towards reform risk derailing the diplomatic engagement that made these very reforms possible. Moreover, doing so prior to the upcoming assessment of the relaxation of oil and gas sanctions in April would be premature at best. Reauthorizing some actions prematurely opens up the opportunity for the Maduro government to backtrack on key aspects of the agreement, undermining the hard-won progress made thus far. In light of the delicate political context in Venezuela, of which I have known for years and worked on for years, and the potential for regression on implementation of the Barbados Agreement, I must therefore oppose this bill, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields. Any further discussion? Ms.
Chairman,
Salazar, how much
I just
time?
would like to comment and just share some of my thoughts.
If the gentlelady will pause, I recognize myself for 5 minutes, and I yield the gentlelady from Florida 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And with all due respect to the ranking member, unfortunately, the Venezuelans have completely and absolutely broken and disqualified themselves from the Barbados Agreement. They signed something that they have not respected in any way, shape, or form. They agreed that the opposition was going to be able to pick their opposition leader. The opposition did it. They went to primaries. The primaries were held. Maria Corina Machado won 96% of the vote. And right now, the Maduro regime is not letting her participate in the presidential elections. What else do you think we need to see? The moment that the Maduro regime authorizes Maria Corina to participate in free and fair elections with international observers, then we could be considering everything else that you deem necessary. But right now, the Maduro regime is just making a joke out of us, the United States. I yield back.
Gentleman yields. Any further discussion? Mr. Connolly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to support the bill, and I thank Ms. Salazar for bringing it before the committee. But I do think that Mr. Meeks, his admonition is something we got to watch carefully. I believe that this bill can actually do the opposite of what he predicts it will do. But if I'm wrong and he's right, we need to reconsider how we approach this issue. But I believe that passing this bill actually strengthens the hands, potentially, of our negotiators with the Maduro government, because then the choice is us or the State Department approach. And hopefully that accelerates rather than discourages the Venezuelans for coming to a negotiated agreement. I also just can't resist saying editorially that Ms. Salazar's passion for Venezuelan democracy is notable and noteworthy, and I applaud it. I wish I heard similar passion defending American democracy from some of our colleagues. We can't be passionate about Venezuelan democracy, but turn a blind eye when a particular candidate of one party talks about a bloodbath if he's not elected, talks about a revenge tour, talks about being a dictator for a day. We can't have a double standard here. We can't say we deplore dictatorship in Venezuela, but we are blind and deaf to threats of it here at home. And I cannot resist but urging my colleagues to speak out when they hear that kind of language so that we're consistent both in Venezuela and in our own democracy. I thank the chair and I yield back.
Gentleman yields. Any further discussion? Mr. Castro is recognized.
Thank you, Chairman. Today, the committee is reviewing legislation related to democracy, human rights, and development at a crucial moment for Venezuela and its people. The Venezuelan people have been engaged in a long-running fight to restore their country's democracy, especially after the Maduro regime's illegitimate efforts to dismiss the Venezuelan National Assembly in 2017 and revise the Venezuelan Constitution. Last year, for the first time in a decade, negotiators for Nicolas Maduro and the Venezuelan opposition reached an agreement in Barbados to establish the conditions for competitive elections. The United States, in support of the Barbados Agreement, also provided limited sanctions relief with the expectation that all candidates for office would be reinstated, all who want to run for the presidency be allowed to do so, and wrongfully detained U.S. nationals and Venezuelan political prisoners would be released. I've had the privilege of speaking with the opposition leaders and human rights defenders about the importance of re-engagement and diplomacy to support the establishment of a democratic process. Therefore, I have supported the Biden administration's decision to reverse the, quote, maximum pressure policy and replace it with productive dialogue and engagement with the Venezuelan people and all parts of the Venezuelan opposition, including civil society, the private sector, and local communities. I applaud the efforts of the Venezuelan opposition, which has made great strides in putting aside its differences and uniting for democracy. However, I'm also aware that significant obstacles remain. The efforts of regime-backed courts to disqualify Ms. Maria Corina Machado, who definitively won the opposition's primary election, are extremely concerning. I don't think any of us were under the illusion that the Venezuelan people would have completely free and fair elections in 2024. But the negotiating process is key to establishing a framework for democratic transition and demonstrating the strength of opposition unity. There are two important dates coming up that those of us who care about Venezuelan democracy must keep in mind. March 25th is the deadline for the opposition to put forward their candidates for this year's elections. It's up to the Venezuelan opposition and voters to decide who will be their presidential candidate, given the repressive political situation. I hope that the opposition will not allow Nicolas Maduro to splinter their hard-won unity. The second important date is April 18th, the deadline set by the Biden administration to decide whether it will renew General License 44, which provides relief to Venezuela's oil and gas sector based on Nicolas Maduro's progress towards competitive elections. Given the sensitivities of these decisions that need to be made in the coming weeks, I do not support moving ahead with this legislation at this time. I believe that doing so may disrupt these careful negotiations and potentially give Nicolas Maduro an excuse to blame the United States, which is one he likes to go to all the time. Make no mistake, I believe anti-democratic actors and dictators around the world should be held accountable for their horrific actions, whether on the left or the right. And targeted sanctions is certainly one way to do so. If Nicolas Maduro reneges on the agreement made at Barbados to hold competitive elections, I would support revisiting this legislation and other efforts to hold him and his regime accountable. The Barbados Agreement provides a clear framework to put Venezuela on a path to return to democracy and for its reintegration into the international system. I hope that Nicolas Maduro makes the right choice for himself and the Venezuelan people. With that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields. Any further discussion? There being no further discussion, are there any amendments that any member would like to offer? There being no further amendments, I move the committee report H.R. 6831 to the House with a favorable recommendation. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed signify by saying no.
No.
In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it and the motion is agreed to.
Roll call.
Roll call vote has been requested. Pursuant to chair's previous announcement, this vote will be postponed. Pursuant to notice, I now call up HRES 901, expressing support for democracy and human rights in Pakistan. The resolution was circulated in advance. The clerk shall designate the resolution.
HRES 901, expressing support for democracy and human rights in Pakistan. Whereas Pakistan is an important and
Without objection, first reading is dispensed with. The resolution is considered read and open to amendment at any point. Without objection, the McCormick Amendment in the nature of a substitute, number 132, circulated to members in advance, shall be considered as read and will be treated as text as original text for purposes of amendment. Is there any discussion on the resolution? Mr. McCormick is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for yielding, and I am very appreciative to the committee for bringing this important resolution, House Resolution 901, to markup. HRES 901 acknowledges the robust United States-Pakistan diplomatic partnership and the international humanitarian conventions to which Pakistan is a signatory and addresses recent events in Pakistan that have challenged its democratic election system. The resolution affirms strong United States support for democracy and free and fair elections in Pakistan, calls on the President of the United States and the Secretary of State to collaborate with Pakistan to promote human rights and good governance, urges Pakistan's government to uphold democracy and human rights, and condemns any attempts or efforts to thwart or undermine human rights and democracy in Pakistan. Earlier today, the Foreign Affairs Subcommittee on the Middle East, North Africa, and Central Asia held a hearing on Pakistan's recent elections, during which I discussed the importance of this resolution. I am pleased that my colleagues are discussing our relationship with Pakistan and its recent elections. For over 75 years, the United States and Pakistan have maintained a longstanding diplomatic and economic relationship. Both countries have engaged in various cooperations, including international security, energy, economic development, and disaster relief, making Pakistan a valuable partner to the United States. Moreover, Pakistan's strategic location, neighboring Iran, Afghanistan, China, and India, make it crucial for the United States to keep adversarial nations' influences in check throughout the region. Since 2022, Pakistan has experienced political instability, which has led to political unrest, weak governance, a worsening economic situation, and a vulnerability to undesired foreign influences and exploits. It is in the United States' interest to ensure Pakistan's full commitment to political stability by upholding democracy, human rights, and the rule of law, which will also contribute to regional stability. Democracy is a founding principle in both of our countries, and our two countries must continue to demand and work towards achieving our highest democratic ideals. I'm proud to have introduced House Resolution 901 with my colleagues, Representative Dan Kildee of Michigan. I want to express my sincere gratitude to our 101 co-sponsors, many of whom are on this committee, for their support of this incredibly important topic. I also want to thank committee staff and our partners for working with my office to craft the necessary changes to this resolution to remain current and impactful. I ask for my colleagues' support on this resolution. Thank you, and Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Is there any further discussion on the resolution? There being no further discussion of the resolution, the committee will move to consideration of amendments. Does any member wish to offer an amendment? There being no further amendments, I move that the committee report HRes 901 as amended to the House with a favorable recommendation. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed signify by saying no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the motion is agreed to. Roll call vote. All right. Pursuant to notice.
Request a roll call.
I was waiting for that.
Sorry. Sleep at the wheel.
Roll call vote being requested. Pursuant to the chair's previous announcement, this vote will be postponed. Pursuant to notice, I now call up HR 7710, the Locally Led Development and Humanitarian Response Act. The bill was circulated in advance, and the clerk shall designate the bill.
HR 7710 to authorize and encourage the United States Agency for International Development and to pursue a model of locally led development and humanitarian response and expand engagement with local partners and increase its local partner base.
Without objection, first reading is dispensed with. Bill is considered read and open to amendment at any time. Is there any discussion on the bill? Ms. Jacobs is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This bill is very simple. What it does is it enables USAID to make the reforms necessary so that they can use local partners. Right now, only 10% of USAID funding goes to local partners. In 2022, an analysis by DevEx showed that just 10 contractors won more than 50% of every USAID contract dollar. So this bill is making it easier for USAID to do business in a way that allows local partners to be engaged. Thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman Lay yields back. Is there any further discussion? There being no further discussion of the bill, the committee will move to consideration of amendments. Does any member wish to offer an amendment? There being no amendments, I move that the committee report HR 7710 to the House with a favorable recommendation. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed signify by saying no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The motion is agreed to. Without objection, the motion reconsider is laid on the table. Staff is authorized to make any technical and conforming changes. This concludes our markup. Given the status of members' location currently, we will schedule our votes tomorrow morning at 9:30 a.m. prior to the full committee hearing at 10. We now stand in recess.
Thank you.
Thank you.